The year was 1959. In the shadowed quiet of a rented house in Bad Nauheim, Germany, a king reigned in exile. He had traded the gold lame for army greens, the roar of the crowd for the cold, damp air of a foreign country. And in that quiet, Elvis Presley confided a secret blueprint to his closest friends. Before he ever saw her face, he described his perfect woman. Dark hair, so black it shone blue under the lights, eyes the color of a stormy sky, and most importantly, a purity, a sublime innocence, untouched by the stained, grasping hands of Hollywood. A blank slate. He was building a fantasy long before he found the flesh and blood to inhabit it. So when a 14-year-old girl named Priscilla Beaulieu walked into his life, was it destiny, or was it an audition? When a child becomes the living clay for an icon's most intimate dream, does she discover a fairy tale? Or does she slowly, methodically, lose her own soul in the shadow of the king? The air in the house on Goethestrasse was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken loneliness. The boys, the Memphis Mafia, they tried to fill the void. They brought him stories, they brought him laughter, they brought him girls, an endless parade of star-struck German beauties, all vying for a moment with the handsome, lonely soldier. But they were all wrong. They were too loud, too knowing, too complete. They had their own histories, their own opinions, their own identities, already carved out of the world. He would entertain them for an evening, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, but his eyes remained distant, searching for something none of them could offer. Then she appeared, brought by a family friend, a curiosity presented to the bored king. Priscilla Beaulieu. She was just a child, barely a freshman in high school, her shyness a fragile shield against the overwhelming presence of the most famous man on earth. She wore a simple sailor dress, her face scrubbed clean, her demeanor quiet and watchful. To everyone else in the room, she was a footnote, a momentary distraction. But Elvis saw something else. He saw the blueprint. The dark hair was there, the startlingly blue eyes. But it was the canvas beneath that captivated him, the untouched innocence. Here was a girl who knew him not as a commodity, but as the singer of the sad songs her mother played on the radio. Here was a girl who had not yet learned the cynical transactions of fame. He saw potential. He saw clay. Their early courtship was a strange, meticulously managed affair, conducted under the watchful eyes of her parents. He played the perfect gentleman, charming her stepfather, a U.S. Air Force captain, with talk of respect and honor. He promised to be a friend, a big brother. He never laid a hand on her. That was the masterstroke. His intentions, he assured everyone, were pure, but the project, the quiet, methodical work of creation, had already begun. The gifts started arriving, not just trinkets and jewelry, but carefully selected records and books. He wasn't just courting her, he was educating her. Each record was a lesson in musical taste, his taste. Each movie they watched in his private theater was a tutorial in glamour, in posture, in the kind of smoldering femininity he admired on the silver screen. He would point out an actress, Sophia Loren or Brigitte Bardot, and dissect their appeal. "See how she walks?" he'd murmur in the dark. "See the way she holds her eyes?" They weren't dates, they were study sessions. He was giving her a new history, a new set of cultural references, all curated by him. He was methodically erasing the 14-year-old girl and sketching the outlines of his queen. When his tour of duty ended in 1960, the world expected him to forget the schoolgirl in Germany. It was a footnote, a soldier's dalliance. But Elvis did not forget. The project was far from complete. The phone calls began, stretching across the Atlantic, late-night conversations that further blurred the line between reality and the insulated world he was building for her. He spoke of bringing her to America, to Graceland. Her parents were, rightly, terrified. To send their teenage daughter, alone, to live in the home of a rock-and-roll superstar, thousands of miles away, was unthinkable. It was a scandal waiting to happen. But they had never reckoned with the sheer, gravitational force of Elvis Presley's will. He flew to Los Angeles to meet them personally, turning the full power of his legendary charm upon them. He swore on his mother's grave she would be safe. He promised she would be enrolled in a good Catholic school. He promised they would never be alone. He promised she would be a daughter to his father, Vernon, and his grandmother, Minnie Marie. He was not just asking for their permission, he was making a contract for the raw materials of his masterpiece. They relented. How could they not? He was Elvis Presley. He didn't make requests. He reshaped reality to his liking. And so, in 1962, Priscilla arrived at Graceland. She stepped out of the car not into a home, but into a soundstage, a living dollhouse, built by the king, for the king. And the real work was about to begin. The first order of business was the look. Her natural, soft brown hair would not do. It lacked drama. It lacked impact. It had to be black. Jet black. The same shade as his. He personally oversaw the process, sending for his own hairstylist, instructing him on the exact shade of dye, the precise application. He wanted her to be a reflection, a perfect, feminine echo of his own dark, brooding image. But not everyone was enchanted. From his office downstairs, Vernon Presley watched the transformation with a deep, unsettling suspicion. He saw the packages arriving daily, the endless stream of dresses and shoes. He saw the bills. But more than the money, he saw the obsession in his son's eyes. One evening, he pulled aside Lamar Fike, one of Elvis's most trusted friends. "He's trying to make a little Elvis out of her," Vernon muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "It ain't natural. He's trying to mold her into his mother, his ideal woman, all wrapped up in one. Something bad's gonna come of this." The warning hung in the air, a prophecy spoken in the heart of the kingdom. But the king was too busy with his creation to listen. The hair was just the beginning. Next came the posture. He taught her to stand with her feet placed just so, to descend the grand staircase at Graceland with a manufactured grace. Then came the makeup. Her fresh, teenage face was to be completely reconstructed. He demanded a heavier look, a mask of glamour that would both age her and align her with his vision. The eyes were the centerpiece. Thick, black liquid eyeliner, swept up into a dramatic wing. False eyelashes, sometimes 2 pairs at a time, to create a doe-eyed, almost doll-like gaze. He chose the clothes. He would take her on private shopping sprees after hours at Memphis department stores, the doors locked to the public. But she wasn't choosing. He was. He would hold up a dress, study it against her, and nod. Blue, red, gold, bold, solid colors. No prints. Prints were for ordinary girls. His woman was a statement. He dictated the cut, the fit, the fabric. Her wardrobe became a uniform, designed by him, for his approval. He chose the dress. He chose the shoes. He chose the face she wore to the world. The psychological molding was even more intense, more pervasive. Her days were his days. Her nights were his nights. Elvis was a creature of the dark, a nocturnal king who slept until mid-afternoon and came alive only after the sun had bled from the sky. To be with him, Priscilla had to abandon the normal rhythms of life. Her schooling suffered. She would attend classes at Immaculate Conception High School in a fog of exhaustion, then rush back to Graceland to sleep, waiting to be awoken by Elvis around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, when his day was just beginning. Their nights were spent in a bizarre, hermetically sealed loop. They would watch movies in his private theater, ride horses on the Graceland grounds, or simply sit in the music room while he played the piano. The Memphis Mafia was always there, a court of jesters for the king. But Priscilla's role was different. She was to be the silent, adoring audience. He discouraged her from interjecting her own opinions into conversations, especially when the boys were talking business or telling road stories. He wanted her to be a listener, a beautiful, quiet presence whose sole purpose was to adore him. And a strange thing began to happen. The people closest to them, the inner circle, they started to notice it. It was more than just a shared hair color. She started to adopt his mannerisms, a certain turn of the phrase, a way of gesturing with her hand, a low, throaty laugh that was an echo of his own. The project was so successful that she was becoming a mirror. Marty Lacker, a longtime friend, would later recall the eerie phenomenon. "It was like watching a film where you see the star and then a smaller, female version of the star," he said. Her identity was so wrapped up in his that she was losing any sense of where Elvis ended and she began. Was this the ultimate expression of love? A perfect merging of 2 souls? Or was it the terrifying success of a master manipulator? A quiet, insidious act of psychological narcissism? The dollhouse had its own rules, its own pharmacology. To keep Priscilla on his nocturnal schedule, Elvis introduced her to the same pills that governed his own life. Placidil to sleep during the bright, unforgiving hours of the day. Dexedrine to stay awake and alert during the long, rambling nights. He presented them not as drugs but as tools, as simple necessities for their unique lifestyle. He would place a pill in her hand with the same casual intimacy as a kiss. For a 16-year-old girl, isolated and utterly dependent on his love, this was just another part of the fairy tale, another secret language only she and the king shared. Her body chemistry, like her wardrobe and her opinions, was now being curated by him. Graceland, once a symbol of magical escape, was slowly revealing its true nature. It was an island, and she was its sole, captive inhabitant. He rarely took her out in public in Memphis. She was a secret to be polished and perfected behind closed gates. She had no friends her own age. Her only companions were the members of his entourage and their wives, all of whom worked for Elvis, their lives revolving around his whims. Her entire social structure was him. Her entire emotional world was him. The letters she wrote to her parents in Germany were cheerful, edited reports, omitting the strange nocturnal hours, the pills, the profound, creeping loneliness. She was living in the heart of a hurricane of fame, yet she had never been more alone. Then came karate. For Elvis, martial arts was more than a hobby. It was a spiritual obsession, a philosophy of discipline, power, and control. It became his new religion, and he, its most famous prophet. It was not enough that he was a black belt. Priscilla had to become one too. He insisted she take lessons from his own master, Ed Parker. But it wasn't about self-defense. It was another layer of indoctrination. He wanted to shape her mind, her spirit, her very movements, according to the philosophies he now held sacred. He would drill her for hours, correcting her form, her focus, her breathing. He wanted a partner who shared not just his home, but his soul. A soul he was actively redesigning for her. The creation had to be perfect, inside and out. But porcelain, no matter how perfectly crafted, is fragile. The first tiny crack appeared over something trivial, a dress. While on one of their private shopping trips, she saw a wool dress in a muted shade of brown. It was simple, elegant, and she loved it instantly. It was, for a fleeting moment, her own choice. She showed it to Elvis, her eyes bright with a rare spark of personal preference. He looked at it with disdain. "Brown isn't your color," he said flatly. "I don't like you in brown." He explained that she had a royal look. She needed jewel tones. She needed black. She needed white. She needed to look like his queen. The disappointment in his voice was a physical blow. To displease him was to fail at her one true purpose. She put the dress back. She smiled and agreed, but the moment lingered. It was the first time she felt the cold, hard bars of the beautiful cage he had built for her. The first time she realized that her own taste, her own instincts, were not just irrelevant. They were wrong. There was only one correct set of tastes, one correct set of opinions, his. The dynamic was established. He was the sun, she was the planet, held in his orbit. The relationship was built on a profound imbalance of power that was invisible to the outside world, but was the very foundation of their existence. The world saw a fairy tale, but inside the walls of Graceland, a different story was unfolding. It was a story of control, not partnership. Biographer Albert Goldman would later describe it with brutal clarity, stating that Elvis demanded a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week worshiping machine. Her role was to be a receptacle for his dreams, a sounding board for his monologues, and a beautiful object to be admired. He once famously told a friend, "A woman can ruin a man's life if he's not careful. You have to train them, Show them what you expect." Priscilla was his star pupil. The Hollywood years intensified her isolation. When Elvis left to shoot a film, a process that could take months, she was not allowed to join him. The movie sets, he argued, were no place for her. They were filled with temptation, with lecherous actors and fast-talking producers. The irony was devastating. He was the one surrounded by the most beautiful women in the world, while she was left behind, a queen locked in an empty castle. Her days at Graceland became an endless, silent wait. The mansion, once a place of wonder, became a mausoleum of boredom. She would wander the halls, clean her room, read the magazines he approved of, and wait for his nightly phone call. The calls were her lifeline, but they were also a form of surveillance. He would grill her. "Who did you see today? What did you do? Who called the house?" He needed to know that his creation remained untouched, unsullied, waiting perfectly preserved for his return. He, meanwhile, was living a completely different life, a life of glamour, parties, and the constant, adoring attention of his leading ladies. And then, in 1963, a new name began to appear in the gossip columns. A name that would become a dagger in the heart of the dollhouse. Anne Margaret. Fiery, independent, a vibrant, red-headed force of nature. She was his co-star in Viva Las Vegas, and their on-screen chemistry was electric, undeniable. It was so powerful it refused to stay on the screen. The papers called them the hottest new couple in Hollywood. They wrote of secret dates, of a deep, passionate connection. She was everything Priscilla was not. She was a star in her own right, with her own career, her own opinions, her own power. She was not a blank slate. She was a roaring fire. Back in Memphis, Priscilla saw the pictures. She read the stories. For the first time, the king's reassurances over the phone sounded hollow. He would deny everything, calling it press agent nonsense. But the evidence was overwhelming. He had found a new plaything, a real, living woman, not a doll he had to assemble himself. The loneliness in the quiet halls of Graceland curdled into a cold, terrifying dread. The foundation of her entire world, a world built on his singular, focused adoration, was trembling. She confronted him during one of their nightly calls. Her voice, usually so placid and agreeable, was tight with a pain she could no longer hide. In a fit of anger and frustration, he told her it was over, that he was staying in Hollywood. He hung up. The click of the receiver was the sound of her world shattering. For days, she was a ghost in the house, barely eating, her carefully constructed composure dissolving into tears. The doll was broken. The creator had abandoned her. The Memphis Mafia watched, helpless, as the perfect creation began to unravel. But then, just as suddenly, he called back. His voice was soft, apologetic. It had been a mistake, a moment of anger. He needed her. He was coming home. The relief was so immense it was dizzying. He returned to Graceland, and for a while, things seemed perfect. He showered her with gifts, with affection, with promises. He had chosen her. The rival had been vanquished. But something had fundamentally changed. The crack in the porcelain, once formed, could never truly be mended. A seed of doubt had been planted. She had seen, for the first time, that she was replaceable. The unconditional love she believed was the bedrock of her existence was, in fact, terrifyingly conditional. It was conditional on her perfection, on her obedience, and on the absence of a more interesting alternative. The proposal came in late 1966, almost 7 years after they met. It wasn't a passionate, romantic gesture. It was a practical decision, born of pressure. His manager, the formidable Colonel Tom Parker, insisted on it. The long-term arrangement with a young girl was becoming a public relations liability. The whispers were growing louder. It was time to make it official, to legitimize the relationship in the eyes of the world. Elvis presented her with a ring, 3.5 carats, surrounded by a detachable row of smaller diamonds. It was spectacular. It was a statement. It was a contract. The wedding was a farce, a carefully managed press event at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, lasting a mere 8 minutes. The guest list was curated by the Colonel, filled with business associates and a few token family members. Many of Elvis's closest friends, the very men who had watched the relationship unfold from day one, were not even invited. Priscilla was dressed in a white gown she had bought off the rack, disguised as a secret shopper to avoid publicity. Her face was a perfect mask of bridal joy, the makeup flawless, the beehive hair a perfect, lacquered sculpture. She played her part beautifully. But even on her wedding day, she was reminded of her role. As they were about to leave for their honeymoon, Elvis turned to his friend, Joe Esposito. He had one last instruction about his new bride. "Keep an eye on her for me," he said. Even now, as his wife, she was a precious object to be guarded, an asset to be managed. The honeymoon was in Palm Springs, in a house they would christen the House of Tomorrow. But the future was already haunted by the past. The dynamic didn't change with marriage. In fact, it solidified. Now she was Mrs. Elvis Presley. Her identity was legally, publicly, and irrevocably tied to his. The doll now had a permanent place in the dollhouse. Life as a married woman was no different from life as his ward. He went back to making movies, and she went back to waiting in Memphis. But now, she was pregnant. It happened almost immediately, on their honeymoon. For Priscilla, it was a moment of hope. A chance to forge a new, more meaningful connection with her husband. A child would make them a real family. It would have to change things. It would have to make him stay. But for Elvis, the news was complicated. He was initially thrilled, but that thrill was soon tempered by a strange, almost cold detachment. His wife's body was changing, and it was changing without his permission, without his design. The perfect, girlish figure he had so carefully maintained for her through diet and discipline was now swelling, softening. It was a biological reality that interfered with his aesthetic fantasy. His distance grew. During her pregnancy, he suggested a trial separation. He said he needed space. He needed to find himself. The excuse was a thin veil for a darker truth he couldn't admit. He was repulsed by the physical realities of pregnancy. A friend, Sonny West, would later reveal the shocking depth of Elvis's feelings. He told me, "I can't bring myself to make love to her. She's a mother now." The woman he had spent nearly a decade molding into his perfect sexual ideal had suddenly become desanctified in his eyes, elevated to the untouchable, Madonna-like status he reserved for his own deceased mother. The doll had become a mother, and in doing so, had broken the spell. The separation was brief, but the damage was done. Lisa Marie was born in February 1968, exactly 9 months after the wedding. Elvis was a doting father, but a distant husband. He would not touch his wife. The physical intimacy that had been the unspoken promise of their entire relationship, the culmination of years of waiting, was now gone. The dollhouse had a new doll, a real one, and the original was left on the shelf. The loneliness that had always been a quiet hum in the background of her life now became a deafening roar. She was in her early 20s, a new mother, married to the most desired man in the world, and she was utterly, completely alone. He was on the road, relaunching his career with the '68 comeback special, reclaiming his throne. He was electric, dangerous, and more desirable than ever, and he was not coming home. His affairs were no longer secret whispers. They were brazen, public knowledge. He had a girl in every city, a revolving door of co-stars and fans. Priscilla was left in the gilded cage of Graceland, with the staff, the baby, and the suffocating legend of her husband. The creation was complete, perfect, and now obsolete. The artist had moved on to other projects. It was in this profound isolation, this crushing emotional vacuum, that the doll began to notice the world outside the dollhouse. She took up karate again, not at his insistence, but for herself. And it was there she met a man named Mike Stone, the charismatic, world champion instructor. He was everything Elvis was not. He was present. He was attentive. He saw her. Not the creation, not Mrs. Presley. He saw Priscilla. A thought, dangerous and revolutionary, began to form in her mind. A thought that had been suppressed for a decade. A thought about a life of her own. The king had built her from the ground up, piece by perfect piece. He had designed her face, her body, her thoughts. But he had made one critical, fatal error. He had forgotten to build the cage strong enough to hold a human heart. And now, for the very first time, that heart was beginning to beat to its own rhythm. The porcelain face, so perfect and serene, began to crack. And for the first time, the doll began to think for herself. The affair with Mike Stone was not just an affair of the body. It was an affair of the mind. For the first time, Priscilla was asked her opinion. She was listened to. He would ask her what she wanted to do, what she thought. These were simple questions, but to a woman who had spent a decade as a beautiful echo, they were seismic shocks. The love she felt was not just for the man, but for the reflection of herself she saw in his eyes. A whole, intelligent, and capable person. The double life was a torment. The guilt was immense, but it was overshadowed by a thrilling, terrifying new feeling. Self-worth. The porcelain was not just cracking. It was being carefully chipped away from the inside, revealing the living woman beneath. She realized the gilded cage of Graceland, once a fairy tale castle, was a prison built from obsession and loneliness. The king's love was a monumental thing, but it left no room for anyone but himself. To stay would be to let the doll go back on the shelf forever. And so, she made the most difficult decision of her life. She had to leave. She told him in his upstairs office at Graceland in 1972. It was not a scene of Hollywood drama, of screaming matches and shattered glass. It was quiet, heavy, and deeply sad. He sat, the king on his throne, listening to the one subject he could not command. He was hurt, bewildered. He could not understand why anyone would want to leave the universe he had built. "You're not leaving me, are you?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and a child's vulnerability. But the doll was no longer his to command. "I have to," she said, her own voice steady, though her heart was breaking. Leaving Graceland was like stepping off the edge of the world. She was walking away not just from her husband, but from the Presley name, the security, the myth she had been an integral part of. As she drove away, she knew she was leaving the girl he had found in Germany behind forever. It was the death of a creation, but it was the birth of a soul. Their divorce was finalized a year later. They left the courthouse holding hands, a testament to the strange, unbreakable bond that would always exist between them. He could not be her husband, but he would always be the father of her child, the architect of her youth, the great, tragic love of her life. Freed from the dollhouse, Priscilla began the painstaking process of building a life of her own. She was no longer a reflection, but the source of her own light. She became an actress, a businesswoman, a formidable protector of his legacy, transforming his decaying home into a global landmark. She took the name he gave her and imbued it with her own strength, her own identity, her own success. She became the one thing he never designed her to be: independent. The story of Elvis and Priscilla is not a simple tragedy of control and escape. It is a modern myth about creation, identity, and the paradoxical nature of a love so powerful it could build a world, and so possessive it could suffocate anyone who lived in it. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, set out to create the perfect woman, his living doll. And in a final, beautiful irony, he succeeded far beyond his wildest dreams. He built her so strong, so resilient, that she eventually found the power to walk out of his fantasy and into her own reality. The artist lost his masterpiece, but in doing so, he gave the world a true woman of substance. Their legend is a tapestry of love, loneliness, and liberation, a story that continues to fascinate the world. To explore more untold chapters and hidden truths from the life of the king and the people who knew him best, make sure you subscribe to Forever_Elvis_Stories.